Hi, I'm Katy Ambrose. I'm the French horn professor at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm standing here outside the university's new memorial to enslaved laborers, which honors the 4,000 to 5,000 enslaved people who built and maintained these grounds and served as faculty and students. The research that I'm about to share grew out of my discovery of a letter written by Thomas Jefferson, who was the founder of UVA, in which he expressed the desire to purchase enslaved horn players for his use in Monticello. A lot of us don't realize that the French horn holds an uneasy place in American music history from being tied up in slavery and its resulting hypocrisies. Several black founders actually played the horn, but not of their own volition. The recipient of Jefferson's letter never fulfilled his request, but that letter fueled my desire to learn more about the history of institutionalized racism and slavery. The story of the abuses to people of color is not mine to tell. I will never understand what it is to be a descendant of slavery, but what I can do is share what I have learned in an attempt to redress the anonymity of horn players of African and Creole descent to the horn world. This topic grows more relevant as violence against people of color continues and hate groups gain strength in our social media culture. I hope that you learned something from this video and that you'll consider getting involved with an organization working toward racial equality. Thank you.
The first extant iconography of horns in the hunt date from the 17th century. Horn players of color are depicted starting in the 18th century. This is a depiction of Cato, huntsman to the Prince of Wales during the early and mid-18th century. Cato was said to have been the best French horn and trumpet player in England. The mere fact that he is included in this portrait attests to the fact that Cato's horn playing was very highly regarded in hunting circles. Cato's horn playing was not restricted to the hunt. According to Blandford, he was one of the horn players for the first Norwich Festival and performed music written by Handel. At the festival, the same men played both horn and trumpets. While trumpet players were typically the property of royalty, and trombonists were employees of the church, the horn existed in a strange netherworld. There was no membership to a guild necessary in order to play, so trumpet players found that they could escape the legal constraints of their position by doubling on the horn. Cato performed in open-air concerts, and he could have been one of the parties to perform Handel's water music, although he would have been very young. He clearly performed both at the field and in early ensemble settings, and in the words of David Greer, he represents a transitional phase between huntsman hornists and orchestral hornists. Domestic servants, indentured servants, and enslaved persons who could play the horn were in demand not only in England but also in early America. A glance through slave advertisements of colonial-era newspapers shows that a large number of enslaved people had skill at playing the horn. Advertisements were placed for buying and selling enslaved people, and also to locate people who had run away. In this runaway slave advertisement from 1773, there is a listing for an 18-year-old called Pompey, who plays on the French horn. He is listed as a native of Africa and having escaped on board a country craft up the James River. In 1782, the Scottish publication of Selection of Scotch, English, Irish, and Foreign Airs printed a tune that they called a Negro Jig, entitled Pompey Ran Away. The likelihood of this being the same Pompey as the composer refers to is extremely slim, as it was common to rename slaves with names of Roman nobility. But it is an interesting coincidence nonetheless. Horn players could have played this tune on the horn, especially if they had employed the use of hand technique in the bell or played it up an octave. Horn teachers in the colonies were advertised in American newspapers as early as 1736. It was common for slaves in the South to accompany their masters to college and sit with them during class. Some may have learned to play instruments during music lessons. Some were likely taught by professional musicians, similar to what white people would have experienced as an apprenticeship in bricklaying or carpentry or soldering, etc. Despite the laws against their education, profiteering Southerners would teach their enslaved people a trade in order to profit off their skills. As the Revolutionary War began, horn players were used in military music. Harmony music in America grew out of the French and British military traditions, and the information that exists supports the idea that horns were used in a morale-boosting function during the war. French horns were prevalent during the Revolutionary years, but I was unable to find records of specific Revolutionary War bands or any details about musicians other than fifers and drummers. This is likely because the fifers and drummers were enlisted soldiers, but the bands of harmony music were privately contracted by officers. Additionally, military records at this time did not indicate race, so even though it is estimated that over 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army, an exact number is unknown. I think it quite likely that some African American huntsmen were given signaling duties during the Revolutionary War, possibly on the hunting horns from the estates that they came from, or on military trumpets. Mounted troops used brass instruments, usually trumpets, for signaling, whereas troops on foot used fifes and drums. However, during wartime, soldiers used what they could find. Horace Fitzpatrick characterized early European horn players as the sons of huntsmen and foresters on the estates of the great nobles, and from a childhood in the out-of-doors gained a hardiness which was more than a match for the physical demands of the horn. This description of a European huntsman is startlingly reminiscent of William Lee, George Washington's enslaved servant and huntsman. Washington purchased Lee when Lee was approximately 16 years old, and quickly took a liking to the young man. They were both accomplished horse riders and excelled at hunting. The sport of fox hunting is built so that the master of the hunt and the huntsman work in synchrony, and that relationship built a level of trust between these two men that was unusual for their time. As the huntsman at Mount Vernon, William Lee played the hunting horn. Analysis of Washington's financial records reveals that Washington ordered hunting horns at least 4 times and was possibly gifted a horn by the Marquis de Lafayette. The horn pictured here currently resides at Mount Vernon and could have been played by William Lee. This horn was made by the 18th century British hornmaker George Henry Rodenbostel and was given to the estate in 1906 by the family of Dr. Elisha Dick, who had attended Washington on his deathbed. In my visits to Mount Vernon and in consultation with master hornmaker Richard Serafinoff, it is evident that the horn is not in a state to be played nor restored. Professor Serafinoff has graciously crafted a replica of the Rodenbostel horn as a gift to be displayed at Mount Vernon. Minor restoration efforts have been made in the past, so it is difficult to assess whether the damage it suffered happened during contemporary riding damage or in storage. William Lee's riding style was described as quite enthusiastic, so if it did in fact belong to Washington, it could have suffered some falls or tramples. There is insufficient evidence that this specific horn had belonged to Washington, and absolutely no reason to think that Washington himself would have played the horn. But it is certain that Washington did own several horns, and any horns on the estate were purchased for use by William Lee. Lee was alongside Washington during the entirety of the American Revolutionary War. He is included in several paintings of Washington, including Leutz's famous depiction of Washington's crossing of the Delaware. The loyalty Washington felt toward Lee led him to free William Lee upon Washington's death, while all of his other enslaved people would not be freed until after his wife, Martha Washington's death. I was unable to find any evidence to indicate that William Lee ever performed concert music at Mount Vernon, but I still wonder why Washington requested a hunting horn of the largest and best sort in his last purchase order of 1786 after he had retired from the sport of hunting. And I have some small hope that he had intended for Lee to find solace in the instrument during Lee's retirement. Without commentary from Lee, it is impossible to know whether the horn symbolized anything other than servitude and bondage to him. While we can never know how enslaved people and domestic servants felt about their forced status as musicians, insight can be gleaned through slave narratives. Olaudah Equiano and John Merritt were authors of 2 of the first slave narratives, and they were both horn players. Their experiences were vastly different, and while Equiano's relationship to the horn was positive, John Merritt's was complicated. For additional reading on the adventures of the extraordinary Equiano, read his narrative, The Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African. The horn was a source of comfort and joy to Equiano, and while initially the same for John Marrant, music ended up being a symbol of bondage in his life. John Marrant was one of many African Americans who served the British forces during the Revolutionary War. This happened again during the War of 1812, where enslaved people defected to the British side, though once again records on both sides are scarce and race was not documented. For additional reading about the life of John Marrant, including the famous conversion story in which God struck him down just as he was about to use his French horn to disrupt a church service, read his narrative. A narrative of the Lord's wonderful dealings with John Marrant, a black, now going to preach the gospel in Nova Scotia, born in New York, in North America. Although information regarding early American military brass bands is scarce, there is reason to believe that the black brass band tradition stems from the War of 1812 and the years immediately following. In Philadelphia, for example, the 3rd Company of Washington Guards employed a, quote, Negro band, under the leadership of Frank Johnson, that Eileen Southern asserts received its training during the War of 1812. Frank Johnson was widely known as a band leader and bugler, but he was also a French horn player. He's pictured here with what we would now call an orchestral Baroque horn fitted with crooks. By the time of his death in 1844, the use of French horn in bands was on the decline. This was because, with the invention of the valve in 1818, there came many advances in the ways that brass instruments could be utilized. The French horn was so synonymous with harmony music that it was natural for the instrument to be categorized with woodwind instruments. The invention of the sax horn family in the 1840s introduced brass instruments that could produce a loud, homogeneous, mostly in tune sound, and military bands jumped at these horns. Alan Dodworth even went so far as to classify the French horn as the very last acceptable tenor instrument fit for use in a mid to late 19th century brass band. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, many town and militia bands enlisted to serve as a group. Photographic evidence reveals that there were rarely northern bands with more than 16 musicians, and they mostly adhered to Dodworth's brass band instrumentation. Bands were prevalent in both the Northern and Southern armies. Photographs suggest that Southern bands were smaller than Northern ones, some as small as 8 people, and their instrumentation was more varied. We can see in this photo that unlike the Northern band, this Southern band used a hodgepodge of brass instruments. Slaves were conscripted into the Confederate Army as fifers and drummers, and possibly buglers as well. The National Archives and Records Administration has identified some brigade bands of the United States Colored Troops, but there is not a complete listing of names of bandsmen for each band, only for brigade bands numbers 1 and 2 of the Corps d'Afrique. The procurement of instruments and instruction for United States colored bands was at the discretion of the white commanding officers, and racism sometimes played a part in what was available to the musicians. None of the surviving muster rolls, enlistment papers, or discharge papers in the United States NARA lists instruments associated with people in the brigade bands. Bands of the USCT were held in high regard in both the African American and white northern populations. They were excellent tools for recruitment and furthermore showcased how a man could be lifted out of slavery into an existence as a musician soldier. The years between the Civil War and World War I were immensely important to African American history and musical traditions. It was a time of hope and fear. Emancipation symbolized the freedom for African Americans to travel, to sing, and to play music. But those hopes in the eyes of African Americans translated into fear in the eyes of former slave owners and many Southern Americans. The expectation of Reconstruction to mend the divide between North and South failed to assuage white fears, and instead led to the development of the Ku Klux Klan and the tragedy of lynching. The African American band tradition, established by Francis Johnson, was one established path for black musicians. Another was to be an entertainer with touring minstrel bands and circuses. Minstrelsy emerged during the 1820s and reached its peak of popularity around the time of the Civil War. Minstrelsy was a double-edged sword. It provided employment for hundreds of postbellum entertainers, both white and black. But minstrel songs depicted black people in negative ways and promulgated existing stereotypes. Performers would blacken their faces and perform parodies of African American slaves and freemen. They blatantly stole material from enslaved people, and furthermore, they told jokes about slave life. From minstrelsy came the coon song and coon band phenomenon. The cultural fascination with coon songs reached its peak between 1890 and 1910 and solidified stereotypes of African Americans in the broad social system. Minstrelsy and its offshoots were a way for people to destabilize the efforts of Reconstruction while concealing their subversion. Post-Reconstruction America used music to repeat these negative tropes over and over until the signified, quote, coon could justify Jim Crow's segregation. Minstrel show bands, circus annex bands, and vaudeville shows used horn players, both black and white. Some names of these horn players have survived through programs, playbills, advertisements, and personal records, but they don't indicate race. With the establishment of the African American brass band tradition came African American music schools and orchestras. Many of them were founded at the turn of the century in Washington, D.C., New York, New Orleans, Philadelphia, and Chicago. The most famous African American orchestra was the Clef Club Orchestra in New York City, directed by James Reese Europe. They started performing in 1910 and used traditional African American instruments alongside European orchestral instruments, and only performed music written by black composers. They used baritone horns and trombones instead of French horns and bassoons, so unfortunately I was unable to locate any information about French horn players associated with the Clef Club Orchestra. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the military was still segregated. More than 200,000 African American men served in the armed forces, and African American units maintained their own bands with African American, not white, bandmasters. Of all these bands, the 369th under James Reese Europe was the most honored. They performed all across France to packed audiences. Music had been emphasized in President Wilson's administration during World War I as a way to promote patriotism. This emphasis of music in the broader culture was maintained through World War II and led directly to improved instrumental music education in schools. Unfortunately, African American students who wanted to pursue classical music as a profession were mostly out of luck because orchestras either did not allow black members or did not extend them invitations to audition. It was more than 20 years after the first full-time African-American string player was hired before Robert Watt became the first full-time African-American horn player in a major symphony orchestra in 1970. It took over 30 more years for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra to hire their first African-American member on any instrument in 2002. Since African American people were rarely, if ever, invited to audition for symphony orchestras, these classically trained musicians began to find opportunities in jazz ensembles. Horn players like Julius Watkins and Willie Ruff created paths for themselves in the face of racism and the civil rights movement. Julius Watkins is a prime example of an African American musician who was forced to innovate in order to create a career. And he pioneered jazz horn playing because it was the only avenue available to him. He had classical horn training in high school from the principal horn of the Detroit Symphony, and said that he fell in love with the sound of the horn during those years. He toured with dance bands and served in the Naval Reserves during World War II, and after his service, he moved to New York to attend Manhattan School of Music on the GI Bill. Watkins was an innovator in his command and use of the French horn. A number of characteristics that give the horn its beauty in an orchestra are limiting factors in jazz, especially bebop, which was the dominant jazz style of the 1950s and 60s. Watkins' solutions to overcoming the difficulties of playing the horn in a jazz setting were numerous. In analyzing recordings of Watkins' improvised solos, it is clear that he was a horn player on par with the best orchestral and solo horn players of his generation. For detailed biographical information on Julius Watkins, read Patrick Smith's Julius Watkins and the Evolution of the Jazz French Horn Genre. Willie Ruff is about 10 years younger than Watkins would be today. He was inspired by a visit from W.C. Handy to his elementary school and learned to play his family's blowing bugle that was from the Civil War. He says that his fondest memory of music as a child were the traveling carnival and minstrel shows. Ruff lied about his age to enlist in the army at the age of 14. Within 2 years, he switched from playing drums to playing French horn and was accepted into the Army Air Corps Band at the Lockbourne Base in Columbus, Ohio, among the famed Tuskegee Airmen. He says that at Lockbourne, the elders taught youngsters about everything, from music to the value of knowledge to how to survive the American brand of apartheid. After World War II, Ruff attended Yale University, one of about a dozen black students. He experienced racism throughout his professional career, from the legal battle to join the Union in New Haven, to the refusal of the National Symphony Orchestra to allow him to audition, to the verbal and physical violence that he endured on the road with Lionel Hampton's band. But even though he endured these setbacks, Ruff was resilient. He contributed a great deal to the horn world through his collaborations with artists like Paul Hindemith, Quincy Jones, Ingolf Dahl, Billy Strayhorn, Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Gil Evans, and his duo partner Dwight Mitchell. Billy Strayhorn's suite for horn and piano that was written for the Mitchell-Ruff duo is one of the most underappreciated pieces of 20th century solo repertoire for the horn. Willie Ruff began his 46-year career on the faculty at Yale in 1971 and immediately created a relationship with the public schools where his students would team teach throughout the city. That program still exists to this day. Willie Ruff retired from teaching at Yale in 2017 and moved back to Alabama, and has since been traveling through the South to historically black colleges and universities, working to create collaborative arts experiences using African American visual art and music. His contributions to the greater musical world are extensive, and their impact reaches across disciplines, races, genders, classes, and cultures. For further reading on this amazing man, read his autobiography, A Call to Assembly. In the 1950s, Julius Watkins opened the ears of musicians who had never heard an African-American person play the French horn. In the 1960s, Willie Ruff opened people's eyes to the same prospect. In the 1970s, Robert Lee Watt became the first African-American horn player in a major symphony orchestra and opened the mind of the musical world. As the first horn player to break the color barrier in the orchestral world, Watt experienced overt and covert racism in the workplace. There was a constant flow of interactions with well-intentioned but ignorant colleagues who exhibited microaggressions on a daily basis. One of the key tenets of critical race theory is that white supremacy and racial power are maintained over time. Studies show that constant exposure to microaggression will lead to disengagement. Bob Watt explored other avenues for the horn and cultivated playing opportunities through the recording industry and the African American community in Los Angeles. These other outlets and friendships kept him grounded in the face of a hostile work environment. He retired from the Los Angeles Philharmonic after 38 years in 2008. Robert Watt made the horn a visible instrument to African American communities and unlocked the door for players like Jerome Ashby. For more information on the trailblazing Bob Watt, read his autobiography, The Black Horn. Jerome Ashby served as Associate Principal Horn of the New York Philharmonic from 1979 until his death from prostate cancer in 2007. Ashby's legacy survives through the hundreds of students he taught throughout his career at Juilliard, the Manhattan School of Music, the Curtis Institute of Music, the Aspen Music Festival, and many others. His pedagogy was based in hard work, grit, and never accepting less than what was your best at any given moment. He emphasized an even, rich sound and that everything was in service of the music. His experience inspired his own peers, as well as younger generations of horn players of color, to hold themselves to the highest standards of excellence. His lifelong friend, Marshall Seeley, said that other black horn players took greater pride in themselves because of Jerome. Seeley, as well as Bill Warnick, were two of many African-American musicians who found employment outside of the U.S. during the late 20th century. My research only covers the United States, but it is worth noting that musicians of African and Creole descent were gainfully employed in South America and parts of Europe decades earlier than in the United States. Robert Watt's retirement and Jerome Ashby's death mark the end of the first generation of African American horn players to be allowed to play in symphony orchestras. Many other 20th century African American horn players need to be mentioned. Vincent Chansey, Derek Clark, Junior Collins, Clarence Cooper, Sharon Johnson, Bob Northern, Mark Taylor, Roger Whitworth, and I have undoubtedly missed many on this short list. While some of these horn players are well known, some are not. The goal of this project was to showcase people who, by all other metrics than their race, should be part of the horn history canon. While my research culminated at the end of the 20th century, the 21st century is bright with horn players of all races, due in large part to the efforts of the people mentioned. But there have been many others who suffered racism in silence. I am indebted to Dr. Edward Latham and Robert Lee Watt for their support and counsel throughout this project, and to Jesse McLeod at Mount Vernon and Richard Serafinoff and Celeste Haller-Serafinoff at Indiana University. Numerous people took the time to speak with me about their experiences, but a very special thanks to Marshall Seeley, Bob Watt, Bill Warnick, and Larry Williams. Thank you for sharing your stories and wisdom and giving me the confidence to share this information even though it is not my story to tell. Thank you for watching, and if you are so moved, please donate to Black Lives Matter or one of these other causes in the fight for racial justice.